Some serial killers make the headlines, but the most terrifying ones lurk in the shadows, their stories left untold. Welcome to Behind the Bloodstains, where we uncover the dark and forgotten cases of history's most elusive murderers. From chilling crime scenes to the twisted minds behind them, we dive deep into the stories that never got their spotlight. Until now, because every bloodstain has a story, and some are still waiting to be uncovered.
This podcast contains disturbing content that some listeners may find upsetting. The following episode includes descriptions of true crimes, violence, and discussions of serial killers. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you're sensitive to these topics, you may want to skip this episode.
So I got something super interesting for you today, Damien. And by interesting, I mean absolutely horrifying. I've been going down this true crime rabbit hole lately. And, oh my God, I stumbled across this case that it literally kept me up at night.
Yeah? What case are we talking about? I'm always ready for a deep dive into the darker side of human nature.
So today on Behind the Bloodstains, we're looking at Luis Alfredo Garavito, this Colombian serial killer who's sometimes called the Beast or Tribilin, which is the Spanish name for the Disney character Goofy, which is just so disturbing given what this man did.
Oh, Garavito. Yeah, this is honestly one of the most prolific and truly horrific serial killers in modern history. The numbers alone are just staggering, really.
Right? I mean, we're talking about someone who confessed to murdering more than 190 children during the 1990s. That's not a typo. 190 children. And the way he did it, I actually got nauseous reading about some of this stuff.
It's genuinely disturbing material. The scope of his crimes, the way he targeted vulnerable children, the methods he used, and perhaps most frustrating for many people, the legal outcome. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's not for the faint of heart. So just a warning to our listeners that this episode is going to contain some really disturbing content about violence against children. Seriously, this might be our darkest episode yet.
Absolutely. We'll be discussing child murder, torture, and sexual assault, so please, take care of yourselves and maybe skip this one if those topics are particularly triggering for you.
So, let's talk about Garavito's early life. Because, I'm always interested in, what creates a monster of this magnitude? What was his childhood like?
Well, this is where things get really, really dark from the very beginning. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos was born on January 25, 1957, in Geneva, Colombia. And his early life was it was marked by extreme neglect and severe abuse.
God, I hate how often we see that pattern in these cases. What exactly happened to him?
So from what we know, Garavito was one of 7 children in a really poor family. His father was described as this violent womanizer who physically abused the entire family. Garavito himself later described how his family spent their time arguing, fighting, and throwing words of great caliber at each other.
Ugh, that's awful. So he grew up in this, constant state of fear?
Exactly. He and his siblings would literally hide from their father. Garavito claimed his father only interacted with him for work-related purposes and errands, and would frequently berate him. And to make matters worse, Garavito was actually pulled out of school around 5th grade, when he was just about 11 years old.
Wait, why did they pull him out of school?
His father removed him so he could work and help support the family financially. And get this, his father supposedly discouraged him from making friends or interacting with girls so that he would, focus completely on making money for the family. It's like he was robbed of any semblance of a normal childhood.
That's so messed up. And then there was alleged sexual abuse too, right?
Yeah, and this is where it gets even more disturbing. Around 1969, when Garavito was about 12, he claimed that during a routine vaccination visit, he was sexually molested by a pharmacist who was also the family's neighbor, and apparently close to Garavito's father.
Oh my God.
And this wasn't just, a single incident of abuse. According to Garavito, this man who was apparently very religious didn't just molest him but actually sadistically bit, burned, and cut him during the assault. Though I should mention that some experts have questioned the truth of these claims.
I mean, it's so hard to know what's true with someone like this. Do you think he made it up to, justify his crimes later?
That's actually a really good question. It's certainly possible. Many serial killers do try to create these narratives to explain or somehow rationalize their behavior. But, on the other hand, the cycle of abuse is very real, and many perpetrators were victims themselves at some point.
What happened after that? Like, did he tell anyone?
Reportedly, he didn't disclose these experiences until after his arrest. He claimed he was afraid his family wouldn't believe him. But what we do know is that following this period, people around him described him as becoming very withdrawn, extremely aggressive, and, quote, ready to take revenge on the world.
That's chilling. So you can almost see the transformation happening.
Yeah, and there were some really concerning behaviors that started showing up. According to some reports, he killed and dissected birds out of frustration and may have even started inappropriately touching his younger siblings. By all accounts, this was a child who was deeply traumatized and already showing signs of serious psychological disturbance.
It's just so hard to process. Like, obviously nothing excuses what he did later, but it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, you know? You can see all these warning signs building up.
Absolutely, and that's what makes these cases so frustrating from a prevention standpoint. There were so many red flags, so many points where intervention might have changed the trajectory. But in Colombia during this time period, in a poor family, with the stigma around mental health issues, those interventions just didn't happen.
So what happened as he got older? Did these behaviors, like, escalate during his teenage years?
Yeah, they absolutely did. By adolescence, Garavito was showing, really concerning behaviors. His family moved to Trujillo in 1971, and that's when things seemed to get even worse. He became extremely aggressive and started attempting to initiate sexual relations with local women who rejected him.
Oh God, that's disturbing.
It gets worse. In 1972, when he was about 15, he was actually evicted by his own mother for attempting to sodomize a 5-year-old boy. And then the next year, she kicked him out again after he tried to assault a 6-year-old boy at a train station in Bogota.
Wait, so he was caught and nothing happened? Like, no police involvement?
Well, he was briefly detained after the incident at the train station, but he explained that he only wanted to lightly molest the child. And, that was apparently enough for them to let him go. It's absolutely horrifying when you think about it.
I don't even have words. What was going through his mind at this point?
So this is where we start to see the serious psychological issues developing. According to later psychiatric evaluations, Garavito was suffering from psychosis, paranoia, and severe depression. He made multiple suicide attempts throughout his life and spent about 5 years under psychiatric care.
Did the mental health professionals see any warning signs about what he might do?
That's the thing. He was primarily treated for depression, even though he showed evident signs of psychosis. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication, but there was clearly something much deeper going on. During one psychiatric stay in 1980, he bizarrely told a doctor that he wanted children, before quickly rephrasing it to say he just wanted to start a family.
That's so creepy in retrospect.
Totally. And around this time, he started carrying razor blades, candles, and lighters with him, specifically to torture victims. He later told investigators that he felt constant urges to molest children, often while working at various jobs. And he developed these really strange ritualistic behaviors, like writing his victims' names in a blue notebook and praying for them while pacing his room nude and beating his chest.
What the hell? That sounds like something out of a horror movie.
I know, right? And he was developing these bizarre obsessions, too. He became fixated on Adolf Hitler after reading Mein Kampf, making connections between their lives, like their traumatic childhoods and their supposed homosexual experiences. He told investigators he liked the concentration camps. He also became obsessed with this domestic terrorist named Campo Elias Delgado, who murdered his own mother and others in Bogota in 1986.
So we're seeing this, like, perfect storm of mental health issues, violent fantasies, and these weird fixations on killers and dictators?
Exactly. And between 1980 and 1992, before he started murdering, experts believe he may have raped and tortured around 200 youths. He was documented to have frequent psychotic episodes. In one particularly disturbing incident, he claimed that while using a Ouija board, he entered a state of psychosis, where the devil asked if he would like to serve him. Garavito answered that he would, and the devil supposedly responded, "Kill, that with killing many things may come."
This is just I mean, did anyone around him notice these warning signs?
Well, that's another disturbing part. His friends Jairo Toro and Ancesar Valencia actually saw him drunk and in the company of young boys at local motels. His social circle became aware of his interest in children, but for whatever reason, no one confronted him or reported him. It's mind-boggling how someone this disturbed could slip through so many cracks in society.
And what did the psychiatrists eventually diagnose him with?
After his arrest, psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and noted significant narcissistic personality traits. But you have to wonder if that fully captures the depth of his psychological disturbance. I mean, this was someone who was experiencing hallucinations, delusions, severe mood swings, and compulsive violent urges. The combination of these severe mental health issues with his traumatic background and his developing fixation on violence created, quote, well, what many would simply call a monster.
So, how did he actually find his victims? Like, what was his approach?
So his method was actually really calculated. Garavito specifically targeted children from humble backgrounds. You know, working-class kids, homeless youth, peasants, orphans. He had this, really twisted eye for vulnerability.
God, that's awful. How would he approach them without raising suspicion?
That's the really disturbing part. He was terrified of the dark himself, so he would always approach children in broad daylight, often in public places. I mean, we're talking about crowded city streets, the countryside. Anywhere children might be alone for a moment. And, he would disguise himself to appear trustworthy.
Wait, disguises? Like what?
Yeah, he had several personas he would use. Sometimes he'd dress as a Catholic priest, other times as a school teacher, or even as just a harmless elderly man. And he changed these disguises frequently to avoid anyone connecting the dots. He also had this preference for children with what he called cute faces, particularly those with blue or green eyes and lighter skin and hair.
That's so specific and creepy. How would he convince them to go with him?
Well, he'd offer them small gifts, money, candy, or easy jobs. He'd say things like, hey, I'll give you 500 pesos if you help me with something quick. And because these kids were often from poor backgrounds, that was sometimes enough to convince them.
And then what would happen?
So once he gained their trust, he would walk them to secluded areas, often remote countryside locations. And this part is really calculated. He would encourage them to talk about their personal lives during the walk, wearing them down until they were tired and vulnerable. And all the while he'd be sipping brandy, like half a bottle, to work up his courage, I guess.
Oh my God, this is making me sick. What would happen when they got to these locations?
It's truly horrific. Once they were isolated, he would bind them and intimidate them with a knife. The torture was extensive and prolonged. I don't want to get into all the graphic details, but these children suffered immensely before they died.
I mean, were there any, patterns to what he did? Things that connected the crimes?
Yeah, there were definite signatures. Police found the same items at many crime scenes. Empty bottles of Colombian brandy, containers of lubricants, and very specific types of restraints. He would often use synthetic rope to tie them up, and the crime scenes were remarkably similar. The victims were always found completely naked with bite marks and signs of torture.
Were there any survivors? Did anyone ever escape from him?
Surprisingly, yes. There were a few survivors who managed to escape. One was a 9-year-old boy named William Trujillo, whom Garavito abducted in 1979. Garavito sexually molested and tortured him for about 12 hours, but when Garavito passed out drunk, Trujillo managed to escape. Another was a 16-year-old named Brand Bernal, who actually broke free from his restraints and ran away.
That's at least something. Did their testimonies help catch him eventually?
They absolutely did. William Trujillo was later interviewed on Colombian television, and his description helped build a profile. And there was also a really important incident where Garavito attempted to abduct 12-year-old John Ivan Sabogal, but a homeless teenager nearby heard the struggle and intervened. That actually led directly to Garavito's arrest.
This is just... I'm struggling to comprehend how one person could do this to so many children.
I know. It's beyond comprehension. The scale of his crimes. I mean, he operated across at least 11 departments in Colombia, and even crossed into Ecuador and Venezuela. He was constantly on the move, which made him harder to catch. And he was. He was so methodical about it all. He even kept journals documenting his crimes and collected items from his victims in a black cloth suitcase, which eventually helped police identify him.
So I've been dreading asking this, but, how many victims are we actually talking about here? Like, what's the scale of Garavito's crimes?
So, the confirmed number it's just staggering. Between 1992 and 1999, Garavito confessed to murdering at least 193 children. And, that's just what he admitted to. He was convicted of 138 of the 172 initial charges, but in 2003, he actually confessed to 28 more murders, including 5 adults.
Wait, 5 adults? I thought he only targeted children?
Yeah, it's strange. According to Garavito, he actually ordered those adult killings rather than committing them himself. But the focus of his violence was absolutely on children. And the real number might be even higher. I mean, if his 2003 confession is to be believed, the total victim count could be as high as 221.
Oh my God, that makes him one of the worst in history, right?
Absolutely. He's considered the most prolific serial killer and child molester in modern history. And, what makes it even more disturbing is that before he started killing in 1992, he had already sexually assaulted an estimated 200 minors dating back to the early 1980s.
Jesus. So he was active for nearly 2 decades?
Yeah, and during that whole time, he was essentially drifting from town to town. Wherever he stayed, local reports of child molestation would spike dramatically. He was literally leaving a trail of trauma across the entire country.
What about the actual crimes themselves? I know this is awful, but can you talk about what investigators found?
It's honestly difficult to even describe. The brutality was so extreme that when authorities first discovered the mass graves in 1998, they thought it might be the work of a satanic cult or an international trafficking ring. They couldn't believe one person could be responsible.
What made them so distinctive?
The level of torture was beyond comprehension. The victims were bound and subjected to prolonged sexual assault while being tortured simultaneously. Garavito would. He would stab them with screwdrivers, cut them with broken blades he placed between his fingers, burn them. I mean, some victims had over 100 stab wounds.
I don't even have words.
And there were specific signatures that linked the crimes. The bodies were often found with their throats cut. And there was evidence of mutilation that I honestly don't even want to describe. In November 1998, when they found that first mass grave in Pereira with 36 children, almost all boys, the investigators were just devastated by what they saw.
So this wasn't just murder. It was torture on a scale that's almost unimaginable.
Exactly. And the thing that really haunts investigators is that he seemed to get more brutal over time. His first confirmed murder was 13-year-old Juan Carlos on October 4, 1992. By 1993, he was already escalating, cutting into victims' bodies and doing things that showed he was becoming more sadistic with each crime.
Did he stay in one area, or was he moving around?
He was constantly on the move, which is part of why he was so hard to catch. His crimes spanned at least 11 departments in Colombia, including Valle del Cauca, Boyacá, Meta, Quindío, basically all over the western and central parts of the country. And we know for certain that he killed at least 4 children in Ecuador during the summer of 1998.
How do we know about the Ecuador victims?
Well, he was actually spotted at an all-girls school in Santo Domingo, Ecuador, before fleeing from authorities who were setting up an operation to catch him. They found 2 corpses there, including a young girl who had been assaulted and killed in a way that matched his signature. He specifically confessed to murdering 2 boys in Chone, Ecuador, 14-year-old Abel Gustavo Loyor Vélez, and 12-year-old Jimmy Leonardo Palacios.
And Venezuela, too?
He claimed to have committed murders in Venezuela as well, though those aren't as well documented. But the pattern was always the same, targeting vulnerable children from poor backgrounds, gaining their trust, and then subjecting them to unimaginable horror.
It's hard to process how someone could do this over and over for years without getting caught.
That's part of what makes this case so heartbreaking. Many of his victims were from such marginalized backgrounds that their disappearances weren't even reported. Colombia was also in the midst of a decades-long civil war during this time, which meant that law enforcement resources were stretched thin. And missing children cases, especially from poor families, just didn't get the attention they deserved.
This is honestly one of the most disturbing cases we've ever covered on Behind the Bloodstains.
It really is, and I think what makes it even more disturbing is just how methodical he was. He wasn't just killing impulsively. He was documenting his crimes, keeping trophies, and even praying for his victims afterward in some twisted ritual of his own making.
So how did authorities finally start putting the pieces together? I mean, with crimes spread across so many different regions, that must have been incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's actually quite a remarkable investigation when you think about it. So, the real breakthrough came in November 1998, when some children were playing football in Pereira, and they literally stumbled across a human skeleton. At first, authorities didn't. They didn't pay much attention, but by November 15th, they had discovered these mass graves containing up to 36 children.
Oh my God. And they were all connected?
Exactly. And what was really striking was that they found 41 bodies in the department of Risaralda alone, with another 27 in neighboring Valle del Cauca. And, the bodies showed such similar patterns of binding, sexual assault, and torture that investigators knew they were dealing with something unprecedented.
So at first, did they think it was multiple killers?
That's exactly what they thought initially. I mean, the brutality was so extreme that investigators were like, this has to be some kind of satanic cult, or maybe an international child trafficking ring. They just couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that one person could be responsible for all this.
What changed their minds?
Well, the prosecutor's office started noticing these really specific patterns at the crime scenes. Like, they kept finding the same type of nylon cord used to bind the victims, and the same brands of liquor bottle caps at pretty much all the sites. And that's when they started thinking, wait a minute, this might actually be the work of just one person.
That's terrifying. So what was the big break in the case?
So on February 6, 1999, they found 2 naked children's bodies lying next to each other on a hill near a sugarcane field outside of Palmyra. And then, the very next day, just meters away, they found another child's body. All 3 had their hands bound and showed signs of horrible abuse.
That's awful.
Yeah, but here's where Garavito made a critical mistake. He had apparently passed out partially naked on top of one of the victims while he was drunk. He had a cigarette in his hand that actually caused the cane field to catch fire. He burned himself pretty badly, and in his rush to escape, he left behind his money, his glasses which were burnt, his shorts, shoes, and underwear. And most importantly, there were receipts and a note with an address belonging to his girlfriend, Graciela Zabaleta.
Wait, so his glasses were actually a major clue?
Absolutely critical. The authorities determined from examining them that the killer must be middle-aged and had this really specific eye condition, astigmatism in his left eye. Oh. They also figured out from his shoes that he walked with a limp and was about 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 6 inches tall. That's incredible detective work with such limited technology at that time.
So they built a profile from just those items?
And, there was this false arrest initially. They arrested a local sex offender named Pedro Pablo Ramirez Garcia, who was 44 and had a limp. But then more children started disappearing in Bogota while this guy was in jail, so obviously they had the wrong person.
How did they finally zero in on Garavito?
That's where this detective named Aldemar Duran comes in. He started suspecting Garavito and managed to track down Garavito's girlfriend. She hadn't seen him since December, but, and this is huge, she gave police this black cloth suitcase that Garavito had left with her.
Oh. What was in it?
It was basically a serial killer's treasure chest. There were pictures of young boys, detailed journals of his murders, even tally marks of his victims, and bills showing where he'd been. It was like his own personal trophy collection. This led them to Garavito's place, but by then he was gone, either traveling for work or looking for his next victim.
So they knew who they were looking for but couldn't find him?
Exactly. But you know what's really interesting? There were also these survivors who had escaped from Garavito over the years. And their testimonies were incredibly valuable. There was this one boy, William Trujillo Mora, who was interviewed years later on Colombian TV. Garavito had abducted him back in 1979 when he was just 9 years old, threatened him with a machete, and tortured him for 12 hours before the boy managed to escape when Garavito passed out drunk.
There were survivors? It's horrible what they went through, but thank God they got away.
Yeah, there were several. Another boy, a 16-year-old named Brant Fernie Bernal Alvarez, was working with his father in this cockfighting business when Garavito threatened him with a knife, took him to a secluded area, and started torturing him. But Bernal actually broke free from his restraints and managed to escape.
So with all this evidence and these survivor stories, how did they finally catch him?
It's almost anticlimactic, actually. On April 22, 1999, Garavito was picked up by local police on an unrelated charge: an attempted rape of a 12-year-old boy named John Ivan Sabogal in Villavicencio. Garavito had been drinking brandy and tried to lure the boy by posing as a local politician.
Did they know who they had caught?
Not immediately. He gave them a false ID claiming to be this politician named Bonifacio Morera Liscano. But they were suspicious, and by July 4th they confirmed it was actually Garavito they had in custody. And then the case really broke open.
So they had him in custody, but what came next? How did they get him to confess to all these murders?
Well, the police were really clever about this whole thing. Even though they suspected this guy was Garavito, they needed to definitively connect him to the crimes, right? And, those glasses found at one of the crime scenes became like the smoking gun.
How did they match the glasses to him?
So this is brilliant. Garavito had this really rare eye condition that was only found in men of a certain age group. And those glasses at the crime scene were specially designed for this unique condition. So what the police did was, they scheduled an eye exam for the entire jail where Garavito was being held.
Wait, the entire jail?
Yeah. By making it mandatory for all prisoners, Garavito didn't get suspicious, and they prevented him from lying about his eyesight. It was really smart. And while he was out of his cell for this exam, detectives took DNA samples from his pillow and living area. And that DNA matched what they'd found on the victims.
That's incredible detective work.
It really was. And then in October, they subjected him to this intense 12-hour interrogation. They had a detective who just sat there and read aloud all of his crimes one by one until Garavito just broke down crying.
Oh my God. What did he say?
He explained that he would get drunk and then go looking for young boys. And, he was adamant that he wasn't homosexual, but claimed he was a victim of childhood sexual abuse himself. And during this marathon confession session, he admitted to killing about 140 children in various locations across Colombia.
140 children. I can't even process that number.
Yeah, it's absolutely staggering. And what makes it even more chilling is that he kept these detailed journals of his crimes. He actually had, a counting system with tally marks for his victims. It's like he was keeping score.
What else did they find among his possessions?
So that black suitcase his girlfriend turned over? It contained pictures of young boys, those detailed journals I mentioned, and bills showing his movements throughout Colombia. He essentially documented his own killing spree. And investigators later found that he even collected things from his victims' personal items even body parts that he kept as trophies.
That's absolutely horrifying. Was he remorseful at all during the confession?
That's debatable. He did cry during the confession, but many psychologists who've studied him believe it was more self-pity than actual remorse for his victims. In fact, in later interviews from prison, he tried to minimize his actions and even expressed interest in starting a political career to help abused children once he got out. It's this bizarre disconnect that's common in psychopaths. They just don't experience empathy the way normal people do.
So after his confession, what happened next with the case?
Well, the Colombian authorities weren't just going to take his word for it. They had to prove he committed these crimes. So they started matching his confession details with crime scene evidence, and the pattern was undeniable. His knowledge of details only the killer would know. The DNA evidence, the glasses prescription, his height of about 5 feet 5 inches, the limpet all lined up perfectly.
And how many charges did they actually bring against him?
So officially, there were 172 charges of murder brought against him. But he was eventually found guilty of 138 of those. The others were still under investigation. But what's really interesting is that in 2003, he actually confessed to 28 more murders, including 5 adults, which would bring his total victim count up to over 200.
This became a pretty notorious case in Colombia, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was. It was unprecedented in Colombian history. Nothing of this magnitude had ever been seen before. The media coverage was extensive, and people were just horrified that this could happen to so many children without anyone connecting the dots earlier. It exposed some serious gaps in how missing children cases were handled, especially those from poor or rural communities where resources were limited.
Did the public get to hear from Garavito himself?
Yeah, there was actually this really infamous court hearing where Garavito apologized to the families of the victims. He said, and I'm quoting here, "I want to ask for forgiveness for everything I did, and I am going to confess. Yes, I killed them, and not only those, I killed others." It was this chilling moment of acknowledgement, but for the families, no apology could ever be enough, you know?
I can't even imagine what those families went through, both during the disappearances and then finding out the horrible truth.
No, you really can't. And, what makes this case so significant in Colombian criminal history is not just the number of victims, but how it exposed these systemic issues in society that allowed someone like Garavito to prey on vulnerable children for so long without being caught.
So after all the evidence was gathered and he confessed, what kind of sentence did Garavito actually receive?
Well, this is where things get really interesting and frankly pretty controversial. So Garavito was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison, which is like the longest sentence in Colombian history. It's just this astronomical number that reflects the sheer magnitude of his crimes, right?
Wait, over 1,800 years? That sounds like they were making a statement.
Oh, absolutely. They were definitely trying to send a message with that sentence. But here's the thing. Colombian law actually limits imprisonment to 40 years maximum. And, that's already a significant reduction from the symbolic sentence they gave him.
So he wouldn't serve the full 1,800 years anyway?
No way. But it gets even more complicated. Because Garavito cooperated with the authorities and helped them locate victims' bodies, his sentence was further reduced to just 22 years. 22 years for murdering nearly 200 children. It's really hard for most people to wrap their heads around that,
That's shocking. 22 years for all those murders? That means he would have been eligible for release. When exactly?
So, he would have been eligible for parole in 2023 when he had served 3/5 of his sentence. And, that possibility really disturbed a lot of Colombians. I mean, the idea that someone who committed such horrific crimes against children could potentially walk free after just 2 decades. It just didn't sit right with people.
How did the public respond to this relatively light sentence?
There was widespread outrage, to put it mildly. Many Colombians felt that the punishment simply didn't fit the crime. Some argued that he deserved either life in prison or the death penalty. But, and this is important to note, neither of those penalties actually exist in Colombia.
So the legal system wasn't equipped to handle a case like this?
That's exactly it. Colombian law just had no provision or method to impose a sentence longer than what Garavito received. And people saw this as a major deficiency in the law, like the legal system had never really contemplated how to properly punish someone who committed crimes on this scale. It was like the law wasn't designed with the possibility of serial killers in mind.
Did this case lead to any changes in Colombian law?
Yeah, it absolutely did. As a direct response to the Garavito case and the public outcry that followed, Colombia actually increased the maximum penalty for these types of crimes to 60 years in prison. So while it couldn't be applied retroactively to Garavito, it meant that any future case like this would result in a much longer actual prison term.
Where was he serving his sentence?
He was held in a maximum security prison in Valledupar, in the department of El Cesar in Colombia. And interestingly, he was kept completely separated from all other prisoners, Because, authorities feared he would be killed immediately if placed in the general population. Even hardened criminals have their own code, and crimes against children are considered beyond the pale.
Was there ever any serious consideration of actually releasing him early?
As his potential release date approached, it became a real concern. In fact, in 2021, a judge had to specifically block a request to release Garavito early for good behavior. The judge cited the fact that he hadn't paid a fine that was owed to his victims' families as grounds for denying the release.
And what about the families of the victims? How did they feel about his sentencing?
They were, quote, "They were understandably devastated. Many felt that the justice system had failed them completely. I mean, how do you tell a parent whose child was tortured and murdered that the killer might serve just 22 years? It's an impossible conversation. And many of these families were from poor, marginalized communities that already felt abandoned by the system, so this just reinforced that sense of injustice."
It really highlights how legal systems sometimes aren't prepared for crimes of this magnitude.
Exactly. And, what's particularly disturbing is that Garavito himself remained kind of hopeful about getting out. He even expressed plans to enter Colombian Congress, become a Pentecostal pastor, and marry a woman once released. He had this delusional idea that he could somehow help abused children after getting out of prison. It shows this complete lack of insight into the gravity of what he'd done.
So what was Garavito's life actually like in prison? I mean, how does someone who committed such horrific crimes spend their days behind bars?
So, his prison life was actually pretty isolated. He was held completely separate from other inmates at the maximum security prison in Valledupar. The authorities were, absolutely convinced he wouldn't survive a day in general population because, even among prisoners there's a code, and crimes against children are considered the absolute worst.
I can imagine other prisoners would have targeted him immediately.
Oh, without a doubt. So he was essentially in protective isolation for his entire sentence. But what's really strange is that despite everything, despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Garavito had these bizarrely ambitious plans for his release. He actually told a Colombian senator that he wanted to enter politics after getting out.
Wait, seriously? He thought he could have a political career?
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-boggling, right? He expressed to Senator Carlos Moreno de Caro these plans to not only enter Colombian Congress, but also to become a Pentecostal pastor and get married. He had this completely delusional idea that he could somehow help abused children upon his release. It shows this total disconnect from reality and from the gravity of what he'd done.
That's so disturbing on so many levels. Did he show any genuine remorse during his time in prison?
That's a really complicated question. He would occasionally express what seemed like remorse, but mental health professionals who evaluated him diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and noted strong narcissistic traits. So any apparent remorse was likely, superficial at best. People with these conditions often know how to mimic the appropriate emotions without actually feeling them.
How did he spend his end days in prison?
Most of his time was actually spent in the medical unit of the prison. In his later years, he developed severe eye cancer and leukemia, which eventually left him blind and very weak. He required daily blood transfusions toward the end. When he was able to, he would make handcuffs, earrings, and necklaces as a way to pass the time. It's a strange detail, but that's what he did.
So his health was deteriorating significantly in his final years?
Yeah, absolutely. The cancer and leukemia really took a toll on him. He became increasingly frail, blind, and required constant medical care. And this was all happening as the date of his potential release was approaching, which created this whole other controversy, There were serious debates about whether someone in his medical condition should be released, even setting aside the nature of his crimes.
And he ultimately died in prison, right?
Yes, Garavito died on October 12, 2023, at the age of 66, in a hospital in Valledupar, while still serving his sentence. The prison authorities confirmed his death, though they didn't immediately reveal the exact cause. But it was most likely related to the cancer and leukemia he'd been suffering from.
So he never actually got the chance to be released then?
No, he didn't. He died just around the time when he might have become eligible for parole, having served 3/5 of his sentence. And, his death brought up all kinds of mixed feelings for the victims' families and for Colombian society as a whole. For some, there was relief that he would never walk free. For others, there was this sense that he had somehow, quote, somehow escaped true justice by not serving a longer sentence.
Did the public know he was so ill?
There were some reports about his deteriorating health in Colombian media, but it wasn't widely publicized internationally. When news of his death broke, it actually came as a surprise to many people outside Colombia who'd been following the case. And I think, for many Colombians, his death represented the final chapter in what had been this national nightmare, This case that had exposed serious flaws in their legal system and forced the country to confront some really difficult questions about justice.
And what about the victims' families? How did they react to his death?
The reactions were really mixed. For some families, there was this sense of closure, like a chapter finally ending. But for others, there was this feeling that justice had never truly been served. 22 years in prison, even if that's where he died, just didn't feel adequate for the magnitude of suffering he caused. And, many of these families had been living with this pain for decades, so his death, while significant, couldn't really heal those wounds.
Let's talk about the bigger picture here. What kind of impact did Garavito's case have on Colombia as a whole?
Oh, it was. It was absolutely profound. I think one of the most immediate and tangible impacts was on Colombia's legal system. When people realized that someone who had murdered, nearly 200 children, could potentially serve just 22 years in prison, there was this wave of public outrage. It exposed these really serious flaws in the legal system.
What kind of changes did it lead to?
Well, the most significant change was that Colombia actually increased the maximum penalty for these types of crimes to 60 years in prison. Before Garavito's case, the law just didn't have any provision for dealing with someone who had committed crimes on this scale and level. Nobody had really contemplated the possibility of a serial killer of this magnitude in Colombian society, So the law simply wasn't equipped to handle it.
That makes sense. How do you even begin to create an appropriate sentence for someone who's killed nearly 200 children?
Exactly, and that's the question that Colombian society was wrestling with. Many people were arguing that Garavito deserved either life imprisonment or even the death penalty, neither of which existed in Colombia at the time. And, there was this feeling that the original sentence of 1,853 years was more symbolically appropriate, even if it couldn't be legally enforced.
Was there ever any real possibility of him being released early?
There was, and that's what really scared people. In 2021, there was actually a court hearing where Garavito requested early release for good behavior. And a judge had to specifically block that request on the grounds that he hadn't paid a fine to his victims. Former President Iván Duque even made public statements assuring Colombians that Garavito would remain in prison during his administration. So yeah, it was a real concern.
Wow, that's terrifying to think about. Beyond the legal changes, did this case change how Colombia approached child protection?
Absolutely. Garavito's case really highlighted how vulnerable certain children were, particularly those from low-income families, street children, and those without strong family support. There was a greater emphasis placed on identifying and supporting at-risk children after this case. And, it also led to improvements in how missing children cases were handled by police.
I imagine it affected how Colombians viewed their own communities too.
It did, in profound ways. Garavito was able to commit his crimes partly because he could move easily between towns and cities. He was this nondescript figure who didn't attract much attention. After his case, there was definitely more awareness about strangers approaching children, more community vigilance. Parents became more protective, communities more watchful.
And what about internationally? Did this case have an impact beyond Colombia?
Yeah, it definitely did. Garavito's case is studied by criminologists and law enforcement agencies worldwide. It's become this horrible benchmark in discussions about serial killers and predators who target children. The case highlights the importance of cross-jurisdictional communication in police work, since Garavito operated across so many different regions and even countries.
It's just so disturbing to think about the scale of his crimes. He's among the worst serial killers in recorded history, right?
He is. By confirmed victim count, Luis Garavito is considered the most prolific serial killer in modern history. And what makes his case particularly significant is the detailed documentation and confession, which provided this rare insight into the mind and methods of someone capable of such horrific crimes.
Does his case tell us anything about preventing these kinds of predators in the future?
I think it tells us a lot, actually. It underscores the importance of taking reports of attempted assaults seriously. Remember, Garavito had numerous encounters with law enforcement before his final arrest. It shows the value of maintaining detailed crime records and looking for patterns across different jurisdictions. And perhaps most importantly, it highlights how critical it is to protect vulnerable children and take their reports seriously.
This has been just such a difficult but important topic to discuss. I think it's cases like this that remind us why it's so important to understand the darkest parts of human behavior, if only to prevent them from happening again.
Absolutely. And while it's incredibly difficult to confront stories like Garavito's, understanding these cases helps us build better systems to protect the vulnerable. His legacy isn't just one of horror, it's also one of legal reform, increased vigilance, and a commitment to never letting something like this happen again. If there's any positive to be found in such darkness, it's that his case has potentially saved countless lives through the changes it inspired.
Thank you for sharing this story with us, Lena. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of Behind the Bloodstains. We'll be back next week with another case that shaped criminal history.
And remember, if you want to learn more about the topics we discuss, you can find links and resources on our website. Until next time, stay safe out there.